Indigenous peoples were the first to live in this land we call Canada. They had their own culture, languages, and traditions. As settlers arrived from Europe, they started colonization. Treaties were broken and lands taken. The settlers also wanted to assimilate Indigenous peoples so that they could be civilized to think, speak, and live in the same way as the settlers. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John Macdonald, said that Indigenous children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, in charge of the federal Indian Affairs policy, decided that Indigenous children had to leave their parents and attend residential schools. 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children attended 130 government-sponsored residential schools operated by churches. The odds of children dying in residential schools? 1 in 25. The odds of Canadian soldiers dying in World War II? 1 in 26. The last federally run residential school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. Despite the schools closing, Indigenous children continue to be removed from their homes through the child welfare system. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities continue to be harmed by the multi-generational impacts of residential schools. In 2006, residential school survivors won the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created.
I lost my innocence. I lost my dignity. I lost my pride. I was beaten. I was told that I was stupid, dumb.
We know that among you are the future leaders of this country. Among you are those who are going to govern this land. Among you are those who are going to make important decisions about reconciliation. And you are going to have to come to terms with this history that you're going to hear a little bit about. And we know that's a difficult process, but it all starts with three things. You must watch, you must listen, and you must show respect.
In 2015, the TRC released its findings, along with 94 calls to action that compel the country and its citizens to engage in reconciliation. The calls to action are about equality. They ask everyone to make sure First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities have equal access to things like child welfare, health services, and education. Let's begin by listening to what Indigenous and non-Indigenous children and youth have to say. Here are their voices.
Well, residential schools have basically assimilated our culture. It's the purpose of residential schools was to take the Indian out of the child. So now I find for my people, we have almost lost our culture and we're just hanging on by a thread trying to rebuild our culture, get it back so that we can, I guess, live happily.
Well, it happened and we have to acknowledge that it happened and it's part of our history. And when I first learned about it, I couldn't believe it, since when I pictured Canada, I pictured it as a warm, welcoming, diverse country that's accepting, and I couldn't believe that we would do something so terrible like that.
These things like the Indian Act, it perpetuates systematic racism and oppresses our people. And these kinds of behaviors, they continue while they have these discussions of reconciliation.
You can't have a future without that past, and that's, that was, a dark time for Canada, and that will always be a part of our history, so that always needs to be acknowledged because we're still working towards that.
Well, I had a grandmother that went through it, and to this day she doesn't feel like speaking like the full Inuktitut language, and does things differently because of the reconciliation, and it feels like it's weird, but like it happened, but like it didn't happen at the same time, because like the changes that I have made, but it's still happened, and it's sad.
I think it's important to build that bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and they need to recognize the history of our people and what our grandfathers and grandmothers went through as children.
It's really important to learn what has actually happened and not just sort of put it aside and then go straight to the calls to action, to try to learn the truth of what happened before you can reconcile that.
I agree a lot with what Audrey said, because I feel like a lot of adults don't completely know the whole story, or they think that they do, so I think like they need to understand more and then you can go into reconcile.
Education is like really, really important, because then people realize, like, especially with like this kind of issue, people need to know this is not all right and this isn't what Canada should be doing right now, and that like education is kind of one of the, like, people need to be educated about this to understand it.
We couldn't be where we are without people behind us, without our ancestors behind us, without our elders behind us, and without survivors behind us. We are at this time of immense change. We've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have those recommendations put forward, and we have truths of the past being told.
As that seventh generation that our ancestors prayed for and, our ancestors suffered for, it's our responsibility to make sure that we benefit from treaty, but not only us, but future generations. So we work not only for our current youth right now, but for 7 generations ahead.
One part about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was they would have residential school survivors tell Canadians what their experiences were at residential schools. And it doesn't have to be residential school. It's also like if they were in foster care or the 60s scoop, and it's still happening today. And that I think having to tell Canadians their stories of what they've been through is something that is a change that's gonna affect all Canadians, and that if they've heard about it or they're gonna read it, then they're really gonna have a better understanding of what's next for the future generations.
Well, I actually told my friend that I was doing something, like a documentary about this, and he's like, "What's the DRC?" And I said, well, I was like, oh, I guess people don't know about it. And so I said that it was 94 recommendations that Indigenous people across Canada, like the Commission, combined to like set a strategy for moving forward with and reconciling with Aboriginal issues, understanding like the past, and also like ways to envision a better future. And they covered topics: health, education, child welfare, justice, and I'm pretty sure there's more, but those are the ones at the top of my head.
Calls to action, child welfare, number 1. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care.
How many more Indigenous people are in the foster care system in Canada? And just showing that even though the residential schools are all closed and it's all over, it's still continued on through the 60s scoop, and now the enormous amount of kids who have been removed from their families and put in foster care and separated from their culture. The funding gap between kids on and off reserve is at such a level that a lot of the kids that are in foster care, it's not because their parents are neglecting them, but it's because their reserves don't have the funding to provide the right, or they don't have the housing to be able to provide for these kids, and the government may view that as neglect, even though that they're not getting the same chances as us to live with their families and live a healthy life.
Institutionalized discrimination, I find, is pretty obvious in our justice system. For an example, Indigenous people are way overrepresented in our federal prisons, as well as the Children Aid Society. We have a huge number of Indigenous children and youth in our child welfare system.
We call upon all levels of government to fully implement Jordan's principle.
Jordan River Anderson, his quilt's right over there, was born with a lot of different complex health needs, and he was born, I believe, in a provincially funded hospital, and his family lived on reserve, and once he finally got healthy, it took him years in the hospital, but once he finally got healthy, and he was able to go home, but he'd need support at home, he'd need people to come in to check up on him. The provincial and federal government were arguing over who would pay for his hospital bill and who would pay for the services at home, that any child who wasn't living on reserve would just automatically get from their provincial government. So Jordan had to spend, I believe, an additional 2 years in hospital, just waiting to go home, waiting to be able to live with his family in his community. And I believe at the age of 5, he eventually died in hospital, never getting to go home and live amongst his community members.
I can't imagine living my whole life in the hospital and two governments fighting, over who would pay, and not being able to go back to home. No child should ever have to go through that.
We call upon the federal government to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations children being educated on reserves and those First Nations children being educated off reserves.
When Shannon was in grade 9 and her and her older sister left Attawapskat to go to high school in New Liskeard, Ontario, because they wanted to get a better education, but while they were there, and this was just a year or two before Shannon ended up dying, they were just thinking about how their younger siblings were having to still be educated in these portables right next to the school that was contaminated, so not very far away. And finally, I believe it was last year, the new elementary school in Attawapskat did open up, but it took years and generations of children having to learn in first a school that's contaminated.
Equality between children, because I know that on reserves, the schools aren't as nice and they don't get as much funding.
Well, it's been 4 years since I've learned about, reconciliation and Shannon's Dream, Project of Heart, which are all reconciliation. And I think it's brought so many different good things to my life. Just the fact that I know I'm helping people by doing this, and knowing I have a voice, and this can and hopefully will make a big difference.
For me, it's been 6 years since I've been part of the Caring Society and Reconciliation. And I would say for any youth just getting into it now, attend one of the events, join Aboriginal Studies if your school has it, and if they don't, demand that they should. Everyone deserves to know the facts of what's happening around you. Look online, go to the website, but definitely attend one of the events so you can see just the aroma of people around you. You have to experience it.
We walked into the Governor General's huge house, and we had made hearts in our school, and different people had drawn different things on the heart. We were marching out to the Governor General's house, and so many different kids, adults, survivors. It was really exciting. We took the heart and we got paired up with a survivor, And so we were walking down the driveway with the survivor until the little garden where we were gonna plant the hearts.
I was drumming at the event. Some parts were emotional, some parts were very fun, and it was something that changed a different point of view on people of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal rights. And so that was an amazing moment, an amazing place to be in at the time.
My school was one of the first schools to attend the tribunal. It's when I first met Cindy Blackstock. We had to be very silent because we were actually in the room when it was taking place. We gave her a feather and she held it while she was questioned by the government. So she's basically the voice, and we got to witness someone just standing up for that. So a true hero, really.
Cultural-wise, I'm very happy that I have my dance, know a lot about my culture, know my ceremonies, and because I believe that if we have at least that part, it'll help bring everything else back. Maybe not to the exact, but we could only do what we could do.
A better Canada for me, I would be happy. It's just everybody would be treated equally, and that would just make me happy.
It look like everyone will have the same type of knowledge and type of living, so they don't all have to be, some people don't have to be banished, and some people don't have to be mean to others.
Just imagine, let's say 10 years from now, there's no issues, there's equal funding, there's equal rights, there's no stereotyping, and you could look back and you could say that you participated and you are one of the people who helped, and you're the reason that there's no feeling as good as that.
One last one. Thank you so much.
The history of the residential school is so terrible, and we're still living the remnants of it. And so it's important that children learn about this and understand what all those different laws and rules they made for our people was very bad.
Is anybody listening? Bonjour, bonjour to everybody living here.
Children are experts in love and fairness. They're born that way. And really that's what makes them the best ambassadors for reconciliation. They accept and celebrate difference. And so if they can teach us how to do that, how to not discriminate, how to welcome difference, how to honor people, how to keep our promises. These are all things children know instinctively, and that unfortunately we as adults forget over time. And that's what makes children such great ambassadors for reconciliation. My experience is when they see something that's unfair, they not only care, they do something about it to make it right.
These are things important to us.